Hi, I'm Ross Tones, and I write music as Throwing Snow, and I'm going to introduce you to my track Simmer and how I wrote it. This is how I put together my track Simmer from the album Loma, and it was basically started with these bits of kit, and then each individual bit was then recorded to the computer. So I'm just going to take you through the process of how I did that. So the basis of this track comes from, it's a really simple bass line, but I wanted one single sound to then morph and change throughout the track, and that's why I chose the MFB Dominion Club for a few reasons, mainly because it's got sweepable waveforms and sweepable filter types. So instead of skipping in between waveforms, it kind of smoothly transitions, which is really good. And it's also got lots of sculpting possibilities because you've got two envelopes. One that you can, the contour of the filter can go through this envelope, and then you've got another one for just the overall envelope, which is really fun. And then I sequenced it using the Octatrack. So the way everything is set up is that sync MIDI comes from the Octatrack into a splitter, Kenton splitter box, which then goes into the circuit. And then the circuit out goes to, the MIDI goes to this iConnectivity sound card, which clocks the iPad running sampler. And then the other out of the MIDI goes to the MFB. So I've got it set up on channel 4. So when I press, just make sure, yeah. So this is the MIDI sequence running along here, and it's really simple. There are a few things that are slightly interesting about the sequence, is that they're not all on step. Everyone is slightly shifted, so it's not just a straight pattern. It's got the illusion of swing, but the illusion of swing comes from me slightly changing the hits of each one of these. You can do that by hitting left and right. You can also do really interesting probability stuff, so you can trigger certain notes only 4% of the time, or per pattern, etc. So it's adds interesting ways of adding extra bits of melody. But at the moment it just runs into this. And that's pretty much the entire track, is just this line, but it's how it morphs and is changed. So you can go from really subby sound, and then bring up the contour, which you can hear it feeding into the filter envelope, and then bring up the cutoff. So you get, even with those just two, you can go from a squelchy sound like that, or just a subby sound, to something quite angry and acidy. The other thing is that if I just bring this up, the different waveforms give the synth a totally different character. So it gives you a lot to play with, and the sequence in Simmer is it just rises up from being really subby to being really like acidic, and then back down again. And all that was me playing this sequence, and then doing it several times over and over again, recording it into Ableton via the analog heat, and a little bit of reverb, which is the Otto BAM, which is just behind me. And the way I've got the studio set up means that I can, via the patch bay, I can plug any bit of equipment into, normally the heat and the BAM, because I really like the pairing of those together. And then that goes into the computer. The other bits came from, I wanted to reference like jungle. So in this album, but not at jungle tempo, like slower, at about 125 normally. So I wanted a way of manipulating the breaks and having it in a really intuitive way. So I use a combination of samples that I've created and then loaded into the circuit, which can be sequenced on the circuit itself or on the Octatrack. And the way I've done that is on the MIDI on the Octatrack, I have these channels 1 to 4 as drum 1, drum 2, drum 3, drum 4. And it's, if I just play the sequence, I'll just, so that is all coming off this. And then I can add effects or delays to this. Or reverb to certain hits. So it's a really easy way of manipulating beats, and I really like it because it's got 2 synths on as well. And if you're playing live and things, it's really useful to have something that does many things but is small. So the beats then run into one channel, audio channel on here as well, which is then passed through a filter which drives it a little bit, beefs it up. And then the breaks come from Sampler, and Sampler is an amazing iPad app by Marco Alonso, I think. And it's basically 6 loops or 6 bits of audio that you can play with in multiple different ways. So it's really useful because you can play around with anything, and it's really easy to like create build-ups or spaces or things, but just by manipulating breaks like so this is just, I'll just switch. So this is just where's that kick coming from there? So this is just a break chopped up, so I can just play the break through, or you can which is really fun. And it's got various effects attached to each thing, and they're all really hands-on, and I love using it. And there's another break that I've chopped up and put on here as well, and that's used in the track. And then I've also loaded this sample which Will Plowman made, which is him bowing I think it's a lid of a jar. And it sounds amazing, but if you can, there's a setting on here which is like a granular kind of bow, and you can do some really interesting stuff with it. So the vocal sample from Simmer comes from this, and then the other interesting thing I've got set up is that on the Q output of the Octatrack, I can send any bit of audio that's coming in either from this or from external output or internally within here. If I cue it, it sends it to the input of here via the iConnect for MIDI. So I can record some, so say if we, so if I choose to send that, I think it's set up on this channel. If I choose, I can now record that, and then I will be able to or say because I've just sampled that line, but now I'm messing around it within Sampler. which makes it really fun because I can, especially when I'm playing live, I can take any little bit. It could be a drum sample, or it could be any bit of improvised audio, and then mess around with it. So that's generally how the bits of kit that I use to make Simmer. As an overview, just these bits of kit, but the way they're set up together allows you to, like, there's lots of creative possibilities, if that makes sense. A while ago, when I tried to like slow down a lot of breaks, like when I used to write a lot more drum and bass or jungle, I used to take the original break beats and then mess around with them. But because of the uses of like old samplers and like Akai's and Emus and stuff, and the way they like, especially that 12-bit kind of sound to the samples, I like taking old drum breaks that are meant to be like 160 to 175 or whatever, and then slowing them back down again to almost the original tempo, because then you can, it just sounds odd and it sounds slightly wrong, but I really like the sound. So what these breaks are is they're from years ago, chopped up and then sped up through, I think there's like an S950 there that I used and a few other things. And then they're just old breaks that I've put on here, and you end up being able to change the sounds and make them even rougher. Because, I don't know, there's something aggressive about things, or degraded audio, that I really like. And that to go with something that's really subby and then goes quite acid and quite hard, it's nice to have a break that kind of can stand up to that. The other one is more, it's a shuffly type break. It's a really shuffled break. And this is one that I did in Ableton first a few years ago, just taking a few drum hits and an old breakbeat, which I think was from a sample CD. Not CD, it was like a download or whatever. And then resequence those and put the break back in here complete, and then can mess around with it further. So by the end of it, I kind of forget where things have originally come from, but that's good in a way. Yeah, and then the others, there's like a hat sample that again is from a break messed around in a track called Cosms, then taken out, then messed around with, and then it's back. But for some reason I really love the shuffle on these hi-hats, so I use them a lot. Where's that? Yeah, so it's this sound. And the other thing, the really nice thing about sampler as well is, like, if you set all points on the transient, it triggers, it's like steps through like a little step sequencer, so you can open up a long hi-hat sample. So I often have loops of hi-hats that are quite long, because I know I can chop them to be small and then open them up. So it's quite, I use that as a technique live all the time, when you have a short drum like a hi-hat or a cymbal that starts off short, but as you add more, it adds energy without you having to add an extra element. So it's one of these things that I use all the time. The same principle as a really simple synth line that's not just doing the same thing, but it's progressing towards a point and then coming back, gives it some kind of momentum. So those two little tricks kind of, although the individual parts are really simple, it allows you to manipulate them in a way that it always gives you a bit more energy, or allows you to take energy away. Although I get a main out of the stereo mix, I generally just remember this kind of stuff I'm doing and then play it soloed into here. And then once I get, say if I just get the drum patterns off and the little things to do, especially if it's like, if it's something like, then I'll make sure I've got a bar of it like this, and then the full transition of going from low to high. And this the same thing could be. Oh, it's just. So I've given myself kind of a toolkit. So when I go back to Ableton, I've got all the little bits that I need. And that means that if something comes off here and it's only one kick and it's not quite fitting, it means I can change the kick. And then for live, I'll bring it back and put it back on here. But I'll record everything out basically as like per part, and then arrange it in Ableton, because I pass it through the analog heat as well, which because it means that I can sculpt. Once I've got a rough idea of the sound, I can then sculpt it with the analog heat. Just because it adds quite a lot of subtlety. And the filters on it as well can really pull out some nice heavy bits of bass that you want to keep, and also take out stuff that you just really don't want before it gets to the computer. Everything's done several times, because I want like slight variations and things like that. And especially if I'm doing something with like conditional trigs on here, I want to do it like for 10-15 minutes, because sometimes those conditional trigs will do something beautiful, and sometimes unless you record for a long amount of time, you'll sometimes miss them. Okay, we're in live now. So this is the original session, and I've recorded these bits of the Dominion in, and as you can see by the waveform, they contain certain bits where I've opened up the filter or changed things. So if we just listen to this on. So, and then it should open up towards the end. Okay, so, and there's various different versions of these as well. You see that one's got a slightly different envelope to both the amplitude envelope and the filter compared to. So just each one of these just adds a little bit of variety, and and then towards the end, this end section, I created one that's specifically for the end as well, so I know that I can, and then it just tails off towards the end. I've also backed this up with a bit of sub as well, and that's just, there's a really nice Ableton 808 sub, and as it's only there to back something up, it's just like I've used this and it seems like I've rolled everything off until about 85 hertz, so it's just like a sub punch. Yeah, and further rolled it off with some EQ, so it's just to add some weight. There you go. So that's just a little bit of the sub that's used to back up. You can hear it go, because it's to emphasize that push at the end of the bar, because that's the bit that gives it all the momentum. Because like we talked about with the micro timings on the MF Dominion, being sequenced by the octatrack, and those little micro timings that we've got. That adds the kind of element of shuffle and swing to it. So I want it to back up the back end of that, so it kind of gives it some forward momentum. The other thing is, if you notice with the Dominion, when I change the envelopes, the timings also change, because the envelope, say you're choosing a slower attack, it'll feel as if the note comes in slightly later. So changing the envelopes of the arpeggiated sequence kind of allows you to kind of shift forwards and backwards in the time frame, to give it a little bit of more forward momentum or sometimes backward momentum. See there when that because the envelope on the filter and on the amp are being changed, it kind of feels like it drags, but then comes in fast, which I really like that effect because it gives it some kind of flow to the track. So that sub's just there to back that up. The next bit that comes in is those hi-hats that came from sampler on the Octatrack, and that's just it's really simple, but there's things like I'll just add a little bit of delay towards the end. It's really subtle, but it just makes it flutter a little bit and also adds to that bit of momentum before it drops back down again. So after that we have, then this is the breaks and the drums that come in. So those are again the drums that were chopped up on the Octatrack and on the sampler. And then it looks like I've backed those up with just like an 808 kick that I've cut, 808 kick and a clap that I've kind of made. There's nothing very much special going on here, apart from I really like Ableton's new drum bus thing. For just, like if you want to work on a transient and you don't want to spend ages on it, but you know it just needs a little lift, the drum bus is it's just really good, and it can add a lot of weight to kicks that don't have them as well. So I've obviously added just a tiny little bit of that on the end, and that's just to back up this drum break. And it changes throughout, so that's the original pattern, but as I've progressed, the patterns change as well. And you often don't notice that in the track, but it does give a little bit of variety that sometimes might not come across. So for this, it's just like trying to maintain that swing and that groove. And then there's an additional amen, which again came off the Octatrack by a sampler. And I've just, as you can see, when I played it live on there, I would have just layered the loop on sampler, but I've chopped it up and corrected it slightly to give it. And what I've done here as well is like nick the groove of another break and then apply that to here. So this break is also under the same groove that I've ripped off a break. So it kind of glues drums together in a really nice way. And as you can see, I've glued all of these together with one groove that I've ripped off a break. So that's why you can get quite a lot of movement within something, but it all feels as if it's together. There's this little acid sound which I haven't got set up on that session, but this came from sampler as well. It's just like a little bing, and that's been just recorded off and looped. There's nothing much exciting. Again, a little bit of reverb, and then the last thing is these amazing lid samples that Will Plowman made, and there's a lot more. So I've messed around with it on sampler and played it out, but then I seem to have like a little bit of I really like using flanges to give some 3D space and movement, and then I've got this kind of filter delay on. I don't think, this plugin called Glitch just is gating it slightly, so it's giving it that stutter effect, which I really like using it. So this is just, if I can switch that off, that's the original thing coming through with lots of delays and a flanger, but when you put that on, it chops up the audio into a stutter. And then there's two, I think there's a low and a high. Something I often always do is have things laid on top of each other but an octave apart, and then change those separately as well. So that's the high end one, and then the low chopped up. I often use that on lots of things. Sometimes you want something more defined on the high end, and yet some of the weight. So I often copy it and then mess around with octaves between them, or sometimes more. In terms of automation as well, there's very little. There's a few bits of automated delay and reverb, but pretty much that's it. I've got a little bit of compression, and so this is on the MF Dominion. I've got some compression against the kick. As you can see here, which just will squeeze the synth line to give more space for the kick, really, because it's all kind of getting pretty bassy, but you still want to punch that kick through. So there's a little bit there. Other than that, oh yeah, there's some a little bit of compression on the Dominion, but really not very much. Tiny little bit of overdrive, just because I think I wanted to automate something like that. Yeah, so as you can see, it just slightly gets more overdriven towards the end of each of these passages. Again, the utility thing, the new Ableton Live utility thing is really useful. I use it on almost everything because it just means that if you want something, the bass to be mono, and you're sure of it, then you just stick that on. And it's got a really nice widening, which I haven't used any widening on this because I wanted to sound really mono-y, because it's more of a club track. But yeah, this plugin is really, really useful. And that is pretty much it. There's a slight drum reverb, just to give it some naturalness and to bring those 3 separate drum tracks to sound as if they're coming from the same place. On the master, there's really very little because I try and get the mix as right as possible all the way through the chain, from recording through the analog heat and then into here. But I'll make some changes and tighten things up, and often EQ a lot. But to be honest with you, there's not very much on here apart from getting rid of some bass. So on the master, unless I really need to sculpt it, there's very little other than this little bass roll off at the bottom. This tiny speaker thing, I normally switch on and off occasionally to give me an idea of what a type of master would be, just to make sure nothing's ridiculous and sticking out. But that's normally taken off and it's sent to Matt Colton at Alchemy Mastering to do, and I kind of trust his ears. So, and they always come back sounding better. So I try not to put too much stuff on the master. Again, like, I've got sessions where there's just loads of effects and things and lots of automation, but the idea is for this album was to make the ideas as simple as possible and to do them mainly on hardware and then just take them off and like kind of finish them on live, but basically most of it's done on hardware. So that's why these things are very, very simple. Other albums I've done, like Mosaic and Embers especially, in the whole album's an entire one piece of music that morphs into different tracks for an hour. So my Ableton session ended up being epic and enormous and in this huge diagonal line with my CPU meter running ridiculously high. But it's almost on purpose that I wanted to make it the opposite for this album. So this is why it's like this simple. Thanks for joining me in my studio today. My new album, Loma, is out on Houndstooth now.